Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Cohen. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about whether to take the ISEE or the SSAT. So, first of all, you're going to want to figure out what schools you're applying to and what their requirements are. A lot of schools will accept either the SSAT or ISEE, hence this video, but some will only accept one test. For instance, traditionally New England boarding schools, if you're applying to those, they usually want the SSAT, and New York City schools have traditionally required the ISEE. Now, that said, things have changed a little bit recently. In the past couple of years, New York City schools have begun accepting the SSAT, and a lot of them will accept either exam without preference. And this is an issue. If some schools say they accept either test, they might have a preference for one of the two tests. So make a list of schools you're applying to, and then don't just rely on what the school's website says, but give them a call and ask them, do they, if they accept both, find out if they accept both tests and if they have a preference for one of the two. If a school does have a preference for one of the two tests, it's generally best to submit that test. The reason is that you're going to look like a more interested candidate who's really interested in maybe going to that school if you submit their preferred test, rather than someone who's applying to a bunch of other schools they'd rather go to, and then applying to this particular school maybe as something of an afterthought. Also, you're going to not only look more committed, but it's going to be easier for the school to compare you to the other applicants to that school, because most of those applicants will have submitted the preferred test. That doesn't mean that there aren't circumstances in which you might want to submit the other test. So if if you or your child is a lot better on the ISEE than on the SSAT, but the school prefers the SSAT, you still might want to take and submit the ISEE instead of the SSAT, because you're going to be submitting a lot stronger test score, and that stands to make your application stronger than submitting the SSAT score. The same is true if maybe you're applying to 9 schools that all want the ISEE and one that prefers the SSAT. Unless that SSAT school is really at the top of your list, it might not realistically be worth it to take the SSAT just for that kind of added boost to your application at that one school. Now, if the schools you're applying to give you the option of choosing between the SSAT and ISEE, there's 2 big things to consider. The first is whether the applicant tends to be stronger in verbal work, like English and reading, or in quantitative, in math classes. And the reason for this is that the SSAT has a much more difficult verbal section than the ISEE. And the ISEE is a much more difficult math section. So a really strong verbal student is more likely to do better on the SSAT, and a stronger math student is more likely to do better on the ISEE. The English section is more difficult on the SSAT for a few reasons. One is that the vocabulary tends to be a little bit more advanced on the whole than on the ISEE. The other is the way that vocabulary is tested. The SSAT uses analogies, which can be pretty reasoning intensive, as where the ISEE doesn't have analogies. In their place, the ISEE has sentence completion questions to test vocabulary. These are much easier. The SSAT is better for verbal students better at verbal, and the ISEE for students better at math, not just because of question types, but because of the way the tests are structured. The SSAT and ISEE both have 2 verbal and 2 quantitative sections, but the ISEE has only 2/3 of the SSAT score are devoted to verbal. It has a reading section, and a reading score, a verbal score, and a quantitative score. So one of the three scores is math related, the other two are verbal related. So on the ISEE, on the other hand, it's split down the middle. You have two math scores, math achievement and quantitative reasoning, and two verbal scores, verbal and reading comprehension. So if you do better on verbal, you're more likely to do better on the SSAT, because that's going to make up 2/3 of your score, not just half. In terms of math, the math questions themselves are definitely more difficult on the ISEE than on the SSAT. This didn't used to be the case, but the ISEE a couple years back was revamped, and since then the math has become much more difficult. There's two ways in which they're more difficult. On the one hand, the ISEE features more advanced subject matter. So as where the SSAT math questions tend to be grade level appropriate, the ISEE has more advanced math. Let's say you're an 8th grader taking the test to enter 9th grade. Well, there's going to be some 10th and 11th grade math on the ISEE. Some Algebra 2, trigonometry, things like matrices and vectors. These are learnable, and this higher level math is not tested in an advanced way, but it's something extra to learn that you don't have to learn on the SSAT. The other thing that makes ISEE math more difficult is the question types are a little bit more complex and reasoning intensive than the questions asked on SSAT math. There's one other big factor that makes ISEE math questions more difficult than their SSAT counterpart, and that's that you have much less time to solve them. Depending on the section they give you, I believe it's ISEE gives you 57 or 51 seconds to solve each math question, which is not a lot. By comparison, the SSAT gives you 72 seconds of questions. Beyond whether someone is better at math or verbal, there's another major consideration when choosing between the two. The other real big consideration is testing anxiety and the option to retake the SSAT. You can only take the ISEE once every 6 months. You can also only take the ISEE once you've started the application process, formally begun the application process to a school. This means effectively that you can really only take the ISEE once. And it's going to be in that fall, either December or sometimes in January of the year you're applying to a school. So it's like a make or break one-shot event, and that can create a lot of stress and anxiety that can really hinder performance on the test. This is true for students who have testing anxiety, but it's true for students who might not have testing anxiety. Usually, it can be a lot of pressure. The fact that the fact that the ISEE is a one-shot thing. It can be mitigated by doing a lot of time practice tests. There's a lot of techniques you can use to help alleviate the anxiety, but it is something to consider. The SSAT, on the other hand, is offered, you can take it as many times as you want. It's offered, it's offered 8 times a year, which is a lot. And so you have the option of doing retakes, which takes off a lot of the pressure, and there's benefits beyond less pressure. You can take it a few times and then send your highest score to a school, or many schools will superscore the SSAT, so they'll look at all your SSAT scores and they'll take the highest individual section scores from across test dates and combine them. So this can really work to your advantage, and you can get a higher score by taking it a few times often than you might if you took it just once. Because you don't have to take the SSAT once in the fall when you're applying to schools, you can also take it a different time of year. So let's say the fall is really busy for you, that's the busiest time of year for you or your child. They can prep and take the SSAT in the spring or at a different time. You may have heard about a couple of other differences between the tests, but I just want to stress that these other differences are really minor. So for instance, the ISEE gives you 5 more minutes on the essay, but the essay prompts are very similar. And the ISEE does not have a guessing penalty, whereas the SSAT does. These differences are not going to affect the likelihood of someone doing well on one test versus the other, not in any substantive way. If you're still not sure which test is going to be best for you or your child, I would recommend an official time practice test. Take one or have your child take one of each, and then you can do two things. You can compare the scores and see if one test turned out a lot better than the other. They're usually similar, but some people do better on one versus the other. And you can also figure out if you or your child prefers one test. If you prefer one test, you might be more willing to put more work into prepping for it. That can also be helpful and is an important consideration. People ask about taking both tests. Generally, I would just recommend only prepping for one unless you need to take both for the schools you're applying to. If you're applying, definitely want to go to one school that requires ISEE, one that requires SSAT. They're your top choices. Taking both is okay. There's a lot of overlap between the tests. Prepping for one will definitely help you for the other. If you don't have to take both for the schools you're applying to, like I say, normally just take one. If you want to sit for two, that's okay, but make sure you at least prep really thoroughly for the one. And it's not necessary to take both unless the schools require it, or unless you're really motivated to do so. If you found this video helpful, please like it, share it, or subscribe to my channel, all of which will help me reach more people looking for this type of information. Thanks.